His research revealed that the BBC's Gaza documentary was narrated by the son of Hamas royalty. I'm Jonathan Sacerdoti. David Collier, thanks so much for joining me. We spoke before about a story you did debunking the BBC's anti-Israel narrative. In fact, you've done many. But today you have an enormous story. Tell me what happened.
Well, the BBC, they advertised that they were running this documentary, and the documentary, it looked like a real BBC heartbreaker, and it was about children telling their story of how they survived the Gaza war. So I started as I do. I look at the people behind it and who they are. Who are these children? Because in theory, we should never have seen them before, and randomly pick three children out of Gaza. But that wasn't the case.
Let's start with the fact that, spoiler alert, you found that the BBC featured these innocent little children telling the story, but they weren't actually either new, as you just hinted at, or really the right children to choose. Start off with a headline. Who was the main narrator and what was his connection to Hamas?
Well, I found it was funny. I found him via a Channel 4 news piece that had gone out in about November or December 2023. Realized it was the same child. Now, this kid was the main narrator. He was the one that starts the program and ends the program. He's the voiceover throughout the show. He's their main man. He's the star of the BBC documentary. And I was given his name from a Channel 4 piece from November, but the name was wrong. And they'd attached him and associated him with his father in that video, and that wasn't his father. And that video in itself highlights a key problem that we have. They can say whatever they like. They can appear in front of our cameras, but we can't possibly know the truth. That went out in November 2023 with a false name and a false father. Anyway, I followed him, and it turns out his father is a minister in the government of Hamas in Gaza. So basically, the BBC had given the son of a Hamas minister a microphone and an hour's platform to look for sympathy.
So I was going to try and make an analogy and say it's like getting the son of Angela Rayner or someone to do a ordinary Brit's view of something, but actually it's nothing like that because the Labour Party isn't a prescribed terrorist organisation. And so in that respect, what we're looking at here is the BBC either knew what they did and didn't tell the audience, or they somehow didn't know what they'd done. And that's because I suppose they would claim that it wasn't clear to them, they hadn't known how. So let's go back a bit and work out how you, in the space of one night after this was broadcast, found out exactly what the BBC should have done in their first casting of this child. They should have done a bit of checking to see who he was. How difficult was it for you? You're an expert investigator, but how long did it take you?
Look, it took me a few hours. Okay. I mean, firstly, look, I don't chess beat. I'm not that, but that's my skill set. It took me a few hours. It was all open source, and any proper investigator who can handle social media, because each social media platform has different search techniques, but anybody who really wanted to get to the truth of this could get to the truth. If the BBC had wanted to know who that child was, they could have done so. The problem here is that the BBC basically delegate the responsibility to people they should not trust.
And so they've trusted in this case because they said their usual one that they can't get journalists into Gaza because Israel won't let them. And we've talked, you and I, before about how they actually had a correspondent based in Gaza who chose to leave. But putting that aside, you also found out something about the local crew they used. So it's not just the narrator of the documentary himself.
I mean, we can start with the producers, because this is where the problem arises. The problem arises even before we've got to Gaza. That they've used two producers. Now, one of them, I think, is English. He seems like a decent, filmmaker. He's worked on conflict zones before. What I don't think he has is any experience at all in the Hamas propaganda machine and the industry. So he's just some guy who's just come in thinking it's another Ukraine or another Kabul or something like that, and he can handle it. he's been put alongside a Palestinian activist. This was the second producer, a Palestinian activist. Worse still, until May or June 2024, he was in Gaza. So one of the things that the BBC talk about not being able to have people in Gaza, well, journalists left Gaza. 2 of their own left Gaza, and this is another one who left Gaza. But the idea, what it creates is an imbalance. You have, on the one hand, you have a guy who wants to do a good job, but he just doesn't have the skill set. He doesn't have Arabic. He doesn't understand Arabic culture. He doesn't understand Hamas. He doesn't understand what's going on in the Strip, which means he delegates all of that to a pro-Palestinian activist who spews fake news on his social media every day. That's where it starts. If you go through his time stream, it's the usual kind of Instagram memes that you see where somebody's died, something's happened, and then there's a story attached to the photo. Now, we don't know what really happened, but he's sharing that story. Or I think there was one instance where he said, "This was my home. Even the rubble isn't even enough for them." Like demonization. It's not a journalist. This guy is demonizing and constantly exaggerating and sharing material that's really dubious. Yes, they should have checked him out. So now they hire 2 cameramen. Now, who hires them? Who vetted them? Was it the producer? Because the English guy couldn't have done it. So is it the pro-Palestinian activist who was in Gaza until May or June, who is now hiring at the BBC's expense 2 cameramen who he trusts? This is where it all goes wrong. One of the cameramen, as you pointed out, on 7th of October, he was posting celebratory posts. So this, and it's open on his social media. Are we not at the point where the first question the BBC should be asking about anybody that they're giving money to is, what was that person posting on the 7th of October? They don't even check.
I've seen that the BBC's response to this, specifically in relation to the child, is that they've said that there was no parental input in the content, which I find laughable, because I don't think they would really use that excuse for any other child anywhere else in the world. And indeed, Hamas has such a iron grip over the lives of people in Gaza, never mind the children of actual Hamas leaders. It's almost unthinkable that they could believe that this child is not somehow at least influenced by the upbringing he would have had as the son of a Hamas leader.
Look, I saw the response, and I had to read it a few times because it makes no sense. It wouldn't make sense if this was a single interview on a street that took 15 minutes. But this wasn't that at all. This was them following him around. What do they mean following him around? Did they go to his house? They must have met the father numerous times. And then the dad and the son have multiple interactions during the course of the period of time in which they're being followed. The excuse is, I can't even believe they wrote it. It is so bad.
I'm just looking at your article about this, and I suggest everyone does read it in detail, because the details are actually extraordinary. They're each one more explosive than the previous one. There's one bit I want to take issue with, actually. It's where you said the naivety, stupidity and arrogance of our media has long been apparent. It's allowed Palestinian propagandists to turn our legacy channels into foolish outlets blindly spouting Hamas lies. Now, I agree with almost all of that, but do you think this is naivety and stupidity, or is it actually deliberate? Because I can't understand how the BBC could possibly not have known what you discovered in a few hours. Not to do down your skills, but they could hire people like you using the money that we all have to pay if we pay the license fee. So do you believe that there was stupidity and arrogance in the multi-month production of this documentary?
Okay, I think it's multifaceted. Firstly, to pick up on a point you just made, if I was the head of the BBC, I would have contacted me over a year ago, because I was there pointing things out, making them look stupid. And if the BBC wants to produce top work, I was a necessary part of their toolkit. because whatever they were doing, there were errors, there were weaknesses. It's no good talking about editorial control all the time, because if you follow your editorial guidelines and you keep making a hash of it, there are never weaknesses in your editorial guidelines. It's that simple. So yeah, I would personally, I would have contacted me. I think for the most part, see, it's a mixture. I think for the most part, there's an arrogance, a real arrogance. So the old British, colonial superiority. It's elitist. On top of that, there's been a cancer imported, where, and I don't know if I discussed this with you last time. They've been using Al Jazeera as a recruiting pool for 2 decades, and that you get away with it when you've got a single journalist because the quality around you will cope with any failings. But when you start getting another one and another one and another one, slowly your quality begins to deteriorate. Your internal checks and balances don't work anymore. So that's not incompetent. That there's something malicious, because you've got malicious people inside who are doing what they're doing, and they're basically taking advantage of the vulnerabilities created by the ignorance and the arrogance of the others. So I think it's a combination.
The bit that makes me less forgiving, I think, than that description that you just gave is exactly the bit you said at the beginning. If the BBC cared about not making these mistakes, they know exactly who to ask. Because if I were trying to produce a piece and I was concerned about the vetting of the contributors, exactly as you said, I'd call you up. And I dare say they could afford you. If the BBC gave you a call and said, would you act as a consultant? We're making a documentary in Gaza. I dare say you'd help them, wouldn't you? Your aim is not just to trash the BBC. It's to actually stop them doing this and make their coverage fair and balanced.
Yeah, look, I don't want to trash anyone. I just want, as you point out, I just want people to understand the basic truth here. We saw on October the 7th, we saw what happened. We watched as they live streamed a slaughter of innocent men, women, and children. And they did it proudly. They were boasting. They phoned home to boast to their parents about how many Jews they killed. That's what they were doing. And there were journalists amongst them. And since then, since October the 8th, when they flicked the switch and they want to play victim, we know there are thousands of journalists in Gaza, because everybody with a camera is a journalist in Gaza. And every day we see different journalists. Since then, not a single one of them has produced anything that Hamas wouldn't want you to see. There's been no exclusives about hostages or oh, look, we found this tunnel, or there are Hamas firing rockets from near a building. Not a single journalist, not one, not once, has ever done anything that Hamas didn't want them to do, which means full, total and absolute editorial control by Hamas of every single thing that comes out of Gaza. And if our media haven't learned that by now, they never will. Because it's so obvious and it's so in your face, which means that everything we see, they want us to see. And that should caveat every single news broadcast from
and more
every
importantly,
single one.
everything we don't see, they don't want us to see.
For sure, 100%. But it means that when Sky News report from Gaza, they should caveat it. No, like they used to do with Soviet broadcasts 50 years ago. Exactly the same. We don't know if this is real, but they don't. They choose to do it differently, and that opens, of course, the possibility and in fact the inevitability that they're going to be telling lies.
And let's open up something else you've hinted at there. You talked about hatred and what have you that there is in Gaza. I found another clue that the BBC maybe weren't trying to do an honest job here in the subtitles. So frequently things were mistranslated. There was one section where the boy says, "We were happy, but the Israelis destroyed everything, and so did Hamas." So there was this sort of token mention of Hamas being partially responsible. But the interesting thing was he didn't say Israelis. I know enough Arabic to know that Yahud means Jews, not Israeli. It wasn't the only moment. There were other moments. There was another one with the child who was acting as a sort of paramedic's assistant. He was asked at one point, how many shahids, and they sent him to go and count corpses, apparently. They translated shahid as dead, but we know that that's not accurate. So in a sense, it seems, even when he one point declares Allahu Akbar as he's on his way to go and visit a friend in his tent, they just conveniently didn't bother translating that bit. Do you think the BBC is deliberately trying to hide hatred of Jews, love of martyrdom, and all of those elements in order to perpetuate their version of the conflict, and also to hide the child indoctrination, which is clearly behind these children speaking that way?
Again, complex. Look, firstly, you're right. I saw this. There was one where I think it was a little girl talking about rockets being sent by the Jews, and they didn't even translate it. They translated the few words she said before, and they translated the few words they said afterwards, but that bit they just omitted. So then you ask, well, who's doing the translation? Because it's not the English guy, is it? Who is doing the translation here? It's a complete dependence and agency problem that the BBC have, that they're not vetting. They come into this with such a naive, and again, I come back to the ignorance and naivety. I'm not denying the anti-Semitism. I'm not denying the toxic nature that has been created because they've imported so many Islamists into the BBC network. But I think that what we see is a product. I don't think there's anyone sitting down making plans. I really don't do conspiracies ever. It's just not my thing. I think we see a natural occurrence created by the cocktail of different ingredients. That's how I see it. And there's a racism here at play as well, because what we have is we have the idea they wouldn't do it with white people. They wouldn't do it with any British people, that we don't actually mean what we're saying. You know, this conversation that must have taken place between the Islamists who are saying, no, they don't mean Jews, they mean Israelis. You know, that argument must have taken place, and there must have been ears on the other side who bought into that argument. So it is this conversation between the two. But how you get to a point where you think, as a British elitist, where I think that the Palestinians don't actually know what they're saying. They don't actually mean this. They need a white British person to explain exactly what they really mean. I mean, the racism involved in those kind of, because that's what it is. And that's how it ends up on our screen. So, I think it's a mix. I think there is obviously the cover-up by Islamist elements and the anti-Semites, but I do think that there's that elitist problem where, it's the natives and they need the British people to translate their words properly.
Yeah, again, I think you're being uncharacteristically maybe generous towards them, because it's not just racist, it's dishonest. If you mistranslate words for whatever reason, you are lying to your viewers. When you translate Yahud as Israeli, you're lying. That's it.
I personally, I'm never, uncharacteristically, I've long had enough of the BBC. I think the whole thing needs to be torn down and rebuilt if at all. I think it's got to the point where the material that it pushes out is so toxic, so false, and all it does, I mean, look, there are simple things, right? If you obsess about Israel, which the BBC does, you obsess about it. If you write falsehoods about Israel all the time, which, the BBC does, if you spread and demonize Israel, then what you're doing is you're demonizing Zionism by extension. There's no getting away from it. You're making people think that Israel is not a natural, normal state. You're making people think that Israel isn't acting as any state would. If you're pretending and lying and spreading falsehoods about Israel deliberately, even if it's for implication that Israel is deliberately targeting hospitals or deliberately targeting them, then you are demonizing Israel. You're demonizing Zionism. Now, the truth is, as you know, most Jews, and I don't mean most as in 55%, almost all Jews are Zionists and support the existence of the State of Israel. Forget the fact that every anti-Zionist has one anti-Zionist friend, Jewish friend, locked away in his cupboard. Now, forget that, because every community has outliers. So by extension, you are also demonizing Jews, which means that the BBC is demonizing British Jews who are going to stand up and try to support the existence of Israel. So we are in that it's not a sickening situation, it's beyond sickening that we have a BBC actively spreading anti-Semitism through the veins of the UK community, and it's all funded. The British people are being forced to fund it. So I hope that's not uncharacteristically, because
I'm pleased.
that's how I see it.
I'm pleased I got it out of you eventually. And what I'll say as well, there's some other interesting features of the documentary. It's incredibly emotionally and emotively done. There's no denying it. It's nicely filmed. The use of music. They've done a good production job. What though it revealed was actually interesting to me, because aside from the things that you've mentioned already, they followed some other children. So one of the other ones you mentioned actually turns out to not be, again, just your average Gazan child, but she's actually an Instagram influencer. Interestingly, they said in the piece that she had started a food channel or food blog cooking whilst in the war. And they then went to the shops with her and showed all these markets full of food, the supermarket with food in it, her and her family buying these things. There was no editorial comment given about the fact that they'd rather revealed the lie of this massive famine that had taken over the whole strip. Indeed, most of the people we saw in there did not look like, for example, the 3 starved hostages that we saw released who hadn't eaten during all that time by design of Hamas. So what do you make of those other details like that, of this other girl and her lack of normal childhood, and the food and the shawarma stall? We saw one of them go to a shawarma stall. They very casually bought their shawarma, went to the beach. Tell me a bit about those sorts of things that the documentary glossed over but did show.
Well, look, I mean, you touch on something here that says so much. I don't think the world has ever seen a propaganda industry like the one that exists in Palestinian society globally, but more so in Gaza. I don't think there's ever been anything like it. And they learned quite a long time ago that whatever they say is received happily by the anti-Semites and the lazy people in the United Kingdom and elsewhere in the West. That there's no checks and balances. There's no editorial questioning. They can say whatever they like. They could put somebody, an obese child, in a room and talk about famine at the same time, and someone here would swallow it up. This is so. The fact that there are contradictions consistently throughout Palestinian propaganda material is because we've never checked. There's nobody who cares enough at the BBC or ITV or Sky News or The Guardian or any of those outlets. They just swallow it. So what you're talking about is evidence that there's nobody here that cares. And it shows that they know it because they're not even trying to hide it, and the way that it's done, it's so well, because you said that as well. You say it's great. It's a tearjerker. It's heartbreaking to watch. They are so good at it because they've had decades of experience. It's what they put all of their efforts and professionalism into. I've said before that there are 2 key industries in Gaza. One is terrorism. The other is the journalists who are trying to hide and lie about what it is the terrorists are doing. They're the two key industries. And they're very good at both. You can't take it away from them. They're very good at both. So I was watching it. I mean, this girl you're talking about, you go onto her particular timeline. She's got over 1 million followers on Instagram, and somebody set up a fundraiser for her, which has now over 200,000 euros. And which makes her, in Gazan terms, she's a multimillionaire, this little girl. And that's not her only fundraiser. She has shops where she's selling, T-shirts and other materials. So she's raking it in. And when the BBC back in April, I put this into the article, when the BBC back in the beginning of April were running headlines about famine, she was running Instagram unboxing videos of aid boxes from, I think, the UAE and from Turkey. These situations just make us, and they don't touch on the parents of these children. I mean, for example, that little girl, her father, he passed away sadly through an illness. It's not, he had an illness a couple of years ago. Her father, but he was a captain in the Palestinian police. I haven't quite yet nailed down what his affiliation was, but he's also part of the instrument of control within the Gazan system. So, and what about the little boy, the boy who's in the hospital? What about his family? Where are they?
The ambulance kid.
Yeah, well, again, what we're told and what's real, we don't yet know. I haven't yet finished with the documentary.
Let me ask about that as well, because you mentioned that parts of it looked staged. And I would agree with that, because if anyone who actually has followed for years the material that comes out of Gaza in particular, but generally out of Palestinian sources, is familiar with the phrase Pallywood. And yes. I think that has come to represent this sort of staged imagery that we sometimes see. So I don't want to suggest that all suffering in Gaza and all the horrors that we see are staged, and I know you don't. However, there were, for me, the parts of the documentary that involved the little boy who helps the paramedics looked the most suspicious, simply because he sounded like he'd learnt his lines from a propaganda textbook, and they very carefully used him to show how dreadful it was that even children are now having to man the hospitals. I want to focus in on that element of it. Number one, why do you think parts were staged? And number two, just to touch on what you spoke about a moment ago, the use of their propaganda machine, I think, focuses very, very heavily on children. They always seem to have a ready supply of children. As you said, they appear in multiple news sources. There's one that I remember following a bit a few years ago called Nadine Abdul-Latif, who was extremely prolific in international media. She spoke very good English. She said she wanted to grow up to be a doctor. She really parroted Hamas lines regularly, and they in fact tried to use her a bit at the beginning of this war, but she's grown up a little bit, and at the age of 13 I think she wasn't quite cute enough for them anymore, and so I don't know what happened to her. But have you dug into this element of their training, even possibly grooming of children to be these kind of media representatives?
I did research when I was looking at students coming to study on scholarships in the United Kingdom from Gaza. I began to think, if I was Hamas, then what would I do about students, coming on scholarships to the West? Wouldn't I want to use that pipeline to help me? Because that's what we have to do. You have to look at everything as this is a strategic war. They have their strong points. We have our weaknesses, and they will be sitting there making these calculations. So I started looking at students who were petitioning to come to the UK to study on scholarship programs. And I started to notice something. About 6 months before they arrive, their Facebook changed. Whereas they had all been posting in Arabic, they started posting in English. Whereas they had just been posting normal messages, they started posting the memes and the anti-Israel messaging. And it was almost as if they were going through some kind of course, some kind of training program before they get here. So I firmly believe it exists. It would be an incredible miss if Hamas hadn't considered it. I once came across a program in the Islamic University in Gaza, which is Hamas's university in Gaza, that seemed to suggest it was one of these, like a training program for activists. So I think there is evidence of that. With things like this, everything we see, yes, absolutely. When we're looking at these videos, these kids are trained. You know, they're not, then we don't see the average child. We see a child who has gone through some kind of propaganda training. Another example from the documentary, the little girl walks in, you know, the poor millionaire. She walks in and she's talking about how she was almost hit by 2 bombs or 2 rockets. She's smiling and she's laughing and she's going, I was almost hit. The Israeli Air Force, they shot one and then it didn't explode. And then there was that never happened. I'm sorry. It's nonsense. It's staged. It's choreographed. It's a script. And she says it just happened, if I remember rightly. So where were the camera crew? I thought the camera crew were following her around. Well, they just didn't happen to be outside with her when it happened, but they were inside waiting for her after it happened. I mean, who are they trying to kid?
There was another interesting part that I noted as well, which went without much comment. And I think, again, this is quite clever of them to have deliberately voiced the whole thing with a child. It meant that any actual deep or intelligent analysis of the kind that the viewer deserves, there was an excuse for excluding it because this was through the eyes of a child. Though, of course, somebody sat down and wrote that script, probably with the child or for the child. The child then sat down and recorded the voiceover. So it wasn't such a spontaneous child's eye view. But the bit I'm referring to is the scene with the woman who, we're told, has this baby she's recently given birth to, and that it wasn't a planned pregnancy, and that she was now a single mother because there she is, totally swathed in fabric, just her face poking out. She explains that her husband, who is a criminal drug dealer put in jail in Gaza, had come out of jail and then beat her in public. And in a sense, this was the only hint of the misogyny and chauvinism that goes on in Gazan society. And it went completely kind of unremarked. Instead, it was just about how she was a poor single mother and this was a challenge during the war. What do you make of this technique of the BBC having deliberately done this all through a supposed child's eye view so that they couldn't comment on the abundance of food in the markets or the woman who's beaten by her husband or any of these features, which could have been very insightful in this documentary?
Yeah, possibly. I don't know whether they started with. It's difficult to know. You know what goes on in the conversations between the editorial, the producers at the stage of what should be, what shouldn't be, what kind of messaging they want to get across. I mean, the choice of children is fantastic. It's as what I referred to earlier. That this machine, it's world class. It's brilliant, and they will be studying this 25, 50 years from now, about how Hamas did what they did in Gaza and how they fought. I mean, they have basically turned the world against a liberal democracy, and it's out on the streets supporting a radical Islamic terror organization. It's insane. So yeah, the choice of children, it's brilliant. The girl, it's another one I'm still following up. That story about the husband and all of this. Yeah, they were messaging. You're right. We were shown things that they couldn't discuss and they couldn't bring to light because it's wouldn't work in the eyes of a 13-year-old boy. Do I think it's deliberate? Look, it's like there's 1 or 2 anti-Hamas messages that take place in the documentary, and again, it's very clever because the first thing that if you notice in the BBC response, they actually cite the anti-Hamas messaging. And to be honest, let's just ask the basic question. If Hamas could get the BBC to do an hour-long documentary But there had to be one or two little anti-Hamas messages inside the documentary. Would Hamas willingly pay the price? Well, of course they would. Absolutely, 100%. Which means that little bit that the BBC used and relied on is meaningless. It's junk, just like the rest of their excuse.
And actually, I think it's more than that. I think I would say that the idea of including that tiny bit of criticism, obviously, as you said, gives them that cover. But if it were real, if it were genuine, spontaneous criticism from those Gazans, we actually know what Hamas does to critics of the organization within Gaza. They get shot in the knees, shot in the legs, killed, imprisoned, tortured. There's actual evidence and footage of it. It's been in mainstream news outlets occasionally. So the idea that those children or others would have said critical things about Hamas without fear, unless it was by some kind of agreement, is also deeply suspicious to me.
It's more than suspicious. It's a nonsense. I mean, really is. We know enough about Gaza to know this is just not real. And the fact that the BBC actively engaged in manipulating a British audience, a British audience with license-free money by deploying the son of a Hamas minister to look for sympathy. I'm sorry. As bad as I know the BBC is, and I know it's bad, it shocked. I was doing it. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I really couldn't. It was late that night. I didn't sleep because it was unfolding in front of my eyes at 1 o'clock in the morning, 2 o'clock in the morning, 3, and then I had to nail it down because I can't be right. It can't be possible that they made this bad, an error. How did they do? And so at 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning, I was just rereading and rechecking and going over it all. And yeah, after I published about 7:30 in the morning, I didn't go to sleep. I was so, I have to have made a mistake. There has to be an error here. It can't be true that the BBC has literally just deployed the son of a Hamas minister on a documentary. So I was waiting for somebody to point, because I work alone. I don't work in an editorial team. So even though I do my checks and balances, and I know I'm pretty good at my job, I was waiting for someone to point out the mistake. I really, honestly, let alone heart, I was waiting for someone to say, "Sorry, David, you got it wrong. He's got a twin brother, or something like this." But no. And later on, it became absolutely clear I had it 100% nailed.
Well, what's so startling about that as well is that not only did you have it right, but their response wasn't, "Oh, we didn't know that, and we're deeply sorry, and we ought to make better checks." It was, I mean, I'll read out their response for the purposes of giving them fair hearing. They said, "Gaza, How to Survive a War Zone, a documentary showing the conflict through the eyes of 3 children in Gaza, was produced in line with BBC editorial guidelines, and the BBC had full editorial control. The film told the children's own stories, showing viewers their direct experiences of living through a war, and the children's parents did not have any editorial input. As the BBC has previously explained, the film was edited and directed from London, as independent international journalists are not allowed into Gaza. The film gives audiences a rare glimpse of Gaza during the war, as well as an insight into the children's lives. It hears the voices of other Gazan civilians, several of whom voice anti-Hamas sentiments." So this statement to me revealed that actually either they're claiming they did know, and that's a problem, or they're claiming it doesn't matter, which seems more likely because they say that the parents did not have any editorial input. Either way, it shows a complete disregard for the honesty that you were demanding of them, which I think most of the British public would expect from them. So again, what do you make of that response from them?
You read it out. I've obviously read it several times myself. And you read it out, and again, I can't believe, I honestly cannot believe that's the response. I think when they realized, I don't think they knew. Personally, the BBC is a massive organization, so it's about, who knew what. But I would imagine the BBC hierarchy wouldn't have known because it's nothing to do with them. But at the very point where they realized that the person who fronted their documentary was the son of a Hamas minister, it was their responsibility and their duty to immediately pull the plug on that documentary, just to take it offline and ask questions. That would have been the first thing they should have done. Even if later they decided that maybe it should go back. But the first thing they should have done as soon as they realized how deep the problem was to pull the plug. Instead, I would imagine there were several heated discussions about how to respond, because the BBC always has heated discussions about these things. And then, yes, they came out with a nonsense. I mean, even the part, and I point this out as well, the point where they talk about the international, we did it remotely from Jerusalem because international journalists can't access Gaza, would make sense if one of the producers wasn't a Gazan who had been in Gaza in June. What does that mean? He's not an international journalist. He's a Gazan, and he was there 6 months ago. So even that part doesn't make sense. None of it makes sense. And
the key thing is that they don't say you've got anything wrong. That's what's so shocking about this. They stand by the piece, but they don't say, no, David, you got it wrong. And that's the bit that I find shocking. If you didn't get it wrong, they ought to be deeply apologetic, embarrassed, and doing damage limitation of the kind that you just described, not this kind of typical BBC cover-up. No, you know what? Yeah, you're being very unreasonable. I mean, the son of a Hamas leader, come on, it's a child. How would that have any influence? It's absolutely preposterous that this is the response. And I would say that you're right. They should have pulled it. They should have pulled it from iPlayer. They should have launched an investigation internally. They should have said they would. They should have found who knew, because some of them must have known. They should then publicly fire those people. They should put in place a rigorous system for making sure that can't and doesn't happen again. And they should be hiring David Collier as their internal fact checker, investigator. If they'd sent you this documentary a week ago, 2 weeks ago, 3 months ago, 4 months ago, you could have helped them to make sure that they could make something that wasn't Hamas propaganda, but they didn't. They don't clearly do the checks that they need to.
Well, look, they trust people they shouldn't. I wouldn't ever be invited into a BBC studio. They would never interview me. And that's a start. And something people say, oh, what do you mean? But think about that for a minute. I'm a flag-waving Brit, right? That's why I am, middle of the road, nothing extreme really about my opinions at all. My dad fought in the army in the UK. My grandfather fought in the army in the UK. The monarchist, everything about me. It's just, right, I'm born and bred here. And they wouldn't have me on because I'm too extreme for them, but they wouldn't have a problem bringing on an Islamist. They won't have a problem putting on the head of the Palestine Solidarity Campaign. They don't have a problem bringing in someone from the Muslim Council of Britain or another Islamist organization. That imbalance it's outrageous. That we can't. The BBC it's riddled with this white guilt and anti-Western culture, and it's horrific. It really is, and it's tragic because I'm not anti-BBC at heart. In other words, on paper, I wouldn't have a problem, but what we have here is something. It's a toxic, cancerous entity, and something needs to be done.
Absolutely agree with you. And David, I want to thank you very much for spending the time to talk about this incredible investigative piece you wrote. People should go and see it for themselves at david-collier.com. And you can find that article there and plenty of others from the years of work that you've been doing. And they will see just how meticulous you are and just how detailed your investigations are and how clear they are. And above all else, how they could have done this themselves if they truly wanted to.
100%.
thank you for all your hard work and contribution to pushing the truth out there, and well done on this amazing investigation.
Well, thank you for inviting me. Always a pleasure to be talking to you.